When they walked away, they weren't bracing for your strength. They were bracing for your collapse. Not because you're weak, but because that's the pattern they've learned to expect. Avoidants don't leave with clarity, they leave with a prediction. And that prediction is simple. Distance will create scarcity. Scarcity will create pursuit, and pursuit will restore their sense of control. In their internal logic, separation equals leverage. They believe that by removing themselves, they become the missing resource, the thing you will eventually reach for when the emotional ground starts to dry. But what happens when the ground doesn't crack? This is where the story breaks for them. Because the avoidant isn't prepared for stability without their presence. They're prepared for pain, chaos, and longing. They expect you to replay the connection, analyze every word, and slowly erode into self-doubt. That expectation isn't cruelty, it's conditioning. Many avoidants learned early that closeness comes at a cost, and that distance restores safety. So when they leave, they assume the emotional ecosystem will destabilize on your side, validating their belief that intimacy is dangerous and separation is necessary. What they don't account for is maturity. They don't account for someone who can regulate themselves, someone who can feel lost without panicking, someone who doesn't confuse love with dependence. When you don't chase, when you don't collapse, when you don't scramble to restore connection at the expense of your dignity, the avoidance internal framework starts to wobble, because the absence they created doesn't produce the desperation they anticipated. Instead, it produces quiet. And quiet is terrifying to someone who relies on emotional noise to feel significant. Here's the deeper psychological truth. Avoidants aren't expecting you to fail. They're expecting their strategy to work. Withdrawal has always been their shield and their weapon. It's how they maintain emotional distance while still feeling desired. But when you remain whole without them, that weapon loses its edge. The scarcity they attempted to manufacture doesn't take hold. And suddenly, the distance they created doesn't elevate them. It isolates them. This is where philosophy enters the room. Control only exists where there is attachment to outcome. The avoidant is attached to the outcome of being missed, of being needed, of being irreplaceable through absence. When you don't participate in that dynamic, you don't just disappoint them. You expose the illusion. You demonstrate that love is not proven by suffering and connection is not validated by collapse. And that revelation is deeply unsettling for someone whose entire emotional survival system is built on avoidance. They begin to realize something they never intended to confront. You weren't dependent on that, you were choosing them. And choice is far more threatening than need, because need flatters the ego, but choice requires presence, responsibility, and reciprocity. When they see you grounded, functioning, and emotionally intact, it forces a reframe. The narrative shifts from I had to leave to protect myself to I left someone who could stand on their own. And that realization lands with weight. Notice how this connects to what comes next. This is the moment that seeds guilt. Even if it hasn't surfaced yet, this is the moment their nervous system starts tracking loss, not freedom, because they didn't escape a burden. They walked away from a stable emotional environment, and stability for an avoidant is both desired and feared. They crave it, but they don't trust it. So when you don't break, they don't feel relief. They feel exposed, and here's the quiet power in all of this. You didn't have to prove anything. You didn't have to perform strength or posture confidence. Your steadiness did the speaking for you. You didn't weaponize silence, you simply honored yourself. And in doing so, you disrupted a pattern that had worked for them their entire life. They thought they left you out to dry. What they didn't realize was that you already had your own source. And when someone discovers that the person they abandoned never needed saving, only space to grow, the regret doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as a slow, undeniable awareness that the control they sought was never real and the loss they created was. What happens next is subtle, and because it's subtle, most people miss it. The avoidant doesn't suddenly feel remorse the moment they leave. In fact, initially, they often feel lighter. Distance gives their nervous system a false sense of safety. The pressure drops, the emotional intensity fades, and they tell themselves a familiar story. This was necessary. This was self-protection. This was the right move. That story can hold for a while, but it only holds in the presence of uncertainty. The moment that uncertainty disappears, guilt begins to wake up. When they see that you're not unraveling, something inside them shifts. Not dramatically, not consciously at first, but psychologically, a signal fires that they are not prepared for. You didn't panic. You didn't plead. You didn't collapse into self-blame. You regulated yourself. And emotional regulation is dangerous to someone who depends on emotional suppression, because regulation doesn't create chaos. It creates clarity. And clarity is where guilt lives. Here's the paradox most people don't understand. Guilt in avoidance doesn't come from hurting someone. It comes from realizing that the person they distanced themselves from was emotionally safe. As long as you appear unstable, distressed, or desperate, the avoidant can maintain their self-justifying narrative. They can say, see, this is why closeness is too much. This is why I had to leave. Your pain becomes evidence that separation was necessary. But when you're grounded, calm, and self-directed, that narrative collapses. Your independence becomes a mirror they didn't agree to look into. They begin to sense that the discomfort they avoided wasn't coming from you, it was coming from within them. And that's when guilt emerges, not as an apology, not as accountability, but as an INT, internal disturbance. A quiet question that won't go away. Why do I feel worse now than I did when I left? This is where nervous system psychology matters. Avoidants are conditioned to associate closeness with threat. Their system learned early that intimacy leads to overwhelm, intrusion, or loss of autonomy. So they exit before connection deepens. But when they observe you functioning well without them emotionally, intact, not resentful, not chasing, it creates cognitive dissonance. Because safety was supposed to increase after separation. Instead, it decreases. Why? Because guilt activates after safety is achieved. You don't feel guilt when you're in survival mode. You feel guilt when your system slows down enough to reflect. And your emotional stability gives them that space. Your calm creates the conditions where suppressed emotions can no longer stay buried. Philosophically, this is the moment where responsibility quietly re-enters the room. Not responsibility in the moral sense, but in the existential sense. The realization that their behavior had impact, that their absence mattered, that they didn't leave chaos, they left coherence. And coherence is harder to dismiss than dysfunction. Notice how this ties seamlessly into what you're witnessing externally. They may not reach out. They may not say anything. But internally, their mind starts replaying moments they once minimized. Your patience, your consistency, your emotional availability, things they framed as too much begin to look like stability. And this is deeply unsettling because it suggests they didn't escape danger. They avoided growth. Your independence doesn't punish them. It confronts them. It forces a comparison between who you are becoming and who they are staying, and guilt in this context is not about you. It's about the gap they now feel between their emotional limits, your capacity. This is why trying to provoke guilt never works. Guilt cannot be forced. It must be activated by contrast. And you provide that contrast simply by living well, by not rewriting history, by not demonizing them, by not clinging to the role of the wounded one. You move forward without needing them to understand. And that non-dependence is what destabilizes them. Because the deepest fear of the avoidant is not abandonment, it's being exposed as unnecessary. And then when you don't need them to be okay, they're left alone with the truth they've spent their life avoiding. That connection didn't hurt because it was unsafe, it hurt because it required them to show up. And here's the line I want you to carry with you. When your peace survives their absence, their guilt has nowhere left to hide, then something else begins to happen. Not inside your mind, but inside theirs. Because once guilt has been activated, the avoidance starts paying attention. Not in a healthy, grounded way, but in a vigilant one. They watch, they notice, and what they're looking for, often without realizing it, is confirmatio. And that leaving restored their sense of control. They want to see that the world on your side slowed down after they exited, that the emotional current weakened, that your life became quieter, smaller, more contained. And when that's not what they see, their nervous system reacts. You're not just okay, you're moving, you're building, you're expanding. There's momentum in your life, new routines, new energy, new flow. And this is where the avoidance system panics, even if their face remains calm, because avoidants rely on withdrawal as a way to regulate themselves. Distance is how they reduce emotional load. But distance only works when it creates dependency on the other side. When it doesn't, withdrawal stops being a strategy and starts feeling like a mistake. Let's get precise here. This is not jealousy in the conventional sense. It's not about wanting what you have. It's about losing influence. The avoidant unconsciously measures safety by relevance. As long as they matter emotionally, they feel anchored. When they see your life improving without their involvement, the illusion of relevance collapses. And the nervous system doesn't interpret that as neutrality, it interprets it as threat. From a neurobiological perspective, unpredictability activates the stress response, and your growth is unpredictable to someone who expected emotional scarcity. They thought removing themselves would pause your momentum. Instead, it accelerated it. And now their system is asking a question they don't know how to answer. If my absence didn't diminish them, what did it actually cost me? This is where the panic sets in. Quiet panic, controlled panic. The kind that doesn't show up as tears or dramatic regret, but as restlessness, rumination, and comparison. They begin scanning your life for signs that they're being replaced, not romantically necessarily, but energetically. They wonder if you found a rhythm that doesn't include them, and that realization destabilizes them far more than rejection ever could. Here's the philosophical layer underneath it all. Avoidants often believe that closeness reduces freedom, that being needed equals being trapped. So they equate independence with distance. But what they're witnessing in you contradicts that belief. You are becoming more free without becoming emotionally closed. Your life isn't shrinking into isolation. It's opening into flow. And that forces a painful reassessment. Maybe intimacy wasn't the cage. Maybe avoidance was control, when you strip it down, is about predictability. And avoidants crave predictability because it gives them the illusion of safety. But growth is inherently unpredictable. When your life expands beyond their mental model of you, their sense of order collapses. They no longer know where they stand. They don't know how much they matter. And for someone who equates mattering with safety, that's deeply unsettling. Notice how this connects to the earlier point. First, you didn't. Collapse. Then, guilt emerged. Now, panic follows, because guilt asks, did I hurt someone who didn't deserve it? Panic asks, what if I miscalculated entirely? What if the thing I ran from was not danger, but my own limitation? And again, you didn't provoke this. You didn't posture. You didn't perform success to be seen. You simply continued living. And that continuation is what triggers them, because it suggests that your life force was never dependent on their presence. It was merely sharing space with it. This is why avoidants often resurface right when you're doing well, not because they've healed, not because they've gained insight, but because their nervous system is seeking relief from the destabilization your growth caused. They reach out to reestablish a sense of relevance, to test whether they still occupy space in your emotional world, and this is where your power truly is. Not in whether they come back, but in whether you recognize what's happening. Their panic is not proof of love, it's proof of lost control. And if you mistake one for the other, you hand the power back. So understand this clearly, your expansion is not an attack, it's a signal. A signal that the dynamic has shifted, that the old rules no longer apply, and that whatever connection existed must now meet you at a higher level or not at all. Here's the closing truth to sit with. When your life keeps flowing after someone withdraws, their fear isn't that they lost you, it's that they were never the source of your momentum in the first place. Now here's where the dynamic crosses a line. The avoidant never expects you to cross. Up to this point, they've been tracking you from a distance, watching your stability, feeling the guilt, experiencing the nervous system panic as your life continues to move. But there is one moment that changes everything for them, the moment they realize you didn't fight to keep them, you didn't argue your worth, you didn't chase clarity, you didn't demand closure, you didn't launch emotional appeals to prove how deeply you cared. And in their internal world, that absence of pursuit lands with more force than any confrontation ever could. Because avoidants are not shaped by words, they are shaped by consequences. They are conditioned to withdraw and then wait, to see if the other person will step forward and bridge the distance. That pursuit reassures them that they still matter, that the bond is intact, that their exit did not cost them anything irreversible. When you don't chase, the script collapses, not slowly, immediately, because now the withdrawal has weight. Now it has outcome. This is where reclaiming your energy becomes the most powerful act in the entire story, not as a strategy, not as a performance of strength, but as a natural return of attention to yourself. You stopped pouring emotional labor into someone who couldn't receive it, and in doing so, you quietly shifted the power dynamic. Let's be clear about something most people misunderstand. Silence doesn't impact an avoidant because it hurts them emotionally. Silence impacts an avoidant because it signals finality. Arguments can be revisited. Emotional messages can be reframed. Even anger keeps a door open. But self-respecting disengagement communicates something far more unsettling. The process has ended. Avoidants are experts at living in emotional limbo. They delay, defer, and disengage without closure because ambiguity gives them control. As long as nothing is final, they don't have to fully feel the loss. But when you reclaim your energy, when you redirect your attention and stop orbiting around the connection, you collapse that ambiguity. And suddenly the distance they created becomes real. This is why begging never works and boundaries always do. Begging keeps the dynamic alive. Boundaries close the loop, and avoidants are deeply affected by closed loops because they eliminate the possibility of future regulation. Through reconnection, they can no longer tell themselves, if it gets uncomfortable, I can always go back. Your non-chasing removes that safety valve. Psychologically, this activates what's called irreversible loss. Not loss in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet recognition that the past version of the relationship is no longer accessible. They didn't just step away from you, they stepped away from an energetic exchange that will not be restored in the same form. And that realization lands heavily. Noti. See how this builds on the earlier stages. First, they expected collapse. You stayed stable. Then guilt emerged. Then panic followed as your life expanded. Now something deeper settles in. Respect. Not admiration, not desire. Respect for the fact that you chose yourself without theatrics. That you didn't weaponize emotion or manipulate through absence. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required you to abandon yourself. And that's the part that lingers in their mind, because avoidants often leave relationships where the other person overfunctions emotionally. They're used to partners who explain, persuade, and pursue. What they're not used to is someone who quietly withdraws their energy and moves on without rewriting the story or trying to be understood. This is where irreversibility becomes real. They begin to sense that even if contact were reestablished, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer positioned beneath them, reaching. You are beside yourself, grounded, and that shift cannot be undone. Importantly, this isn't about punishment, it's about alignment. You aligned your behavior with your values. You refused to negotiate your worth through effort, and in doing so, you demonstrated a level of emotional self-trust that avoidants deeply lack. That contrast is not flattering to them, it's confronting. And here's the truth: most people never hear. Avoidants don't fear abandonment as much as they fear irrelevance. When you stop chasing, you don't abandon them. You become unreachable on the level where they once felt powerful. And that loss of access is what forces reflection. So if you're wondering what truly changed the dynamic, it wasn't your silence alone. It was your decision to reinvest your energy where it could actually grow. And here's the line to carry with you. You didn't lose them when they walked away. You gained yourself when you stopped chasing. After the energy has been reclaimed, after the chasing has stopped and the dynamic has shifted, something very specific begins to settle inside the avoidant. And it's not relief, it's shame. Not the dramatic, self-aware kind that leads to accountability, but the quiet, destabilizing kind that grows when there's nothing left to argue with. Because now there's no conflict to distract them, no emotional chaos to point to, no reaction from you that allows them to reframe the story in a way that protects their identity. This is the moment they expect you to soften the past. Avoidants rely on narrative revision. They expect you to minimize what happened, to explain away their withdrawal, to emphasize the good parts, so they don't have to fully face the impact of their behavior. Many people do this unconsciously, hoping it will restore connection or preserve harmony. But when you don't rewrite history, when you don't demonize them, but you also don't excuse them, the avoidant is left with an unfiltered version of events. And that's deeply uncomfortable. Hey, here is why this matters psychologically. Shame doesn't come from being told you did something wrong. Shame comes from seeing yourself clearly when there's no one trying to manage your feelings. As long as you're explaining, defending, or justifying, the avoidant can stay emotionally passive. But when you quietly accept the truth and move forward without commentary, they lose the ability to outsource emotional regulation to you. Your silence here is not avoidance. It's resolution, philosophically. This is the difference between resentment and acceptance. Resentment keeps the past alive. Acceptance closes the file. And avoidants are rarely confronted with closed files because most people keep reopening them in search of understanding. When you don't, the past becomes fixed. And fixed reality is much harder to escape than emotional drama. They begin to feel shame, not because you're punishing them, but because you're no longer participating in illusion. You're not reframing them as misunderstood, wounded, or doing their best. You're also not attacking them. You're simply letting the truth stand on its own. And truth, when left unargued, has weight. This is where their internal dialogue shifts. They start replaying moments they once dismissed. Times you showed patience they didn't return. Times you made space they didn't protect. And now, without your emotional presence to buffer them, those memories land differently. They're no longer filtered through defensiveness. They're experienced directly. Notice how this ties into everything that came before. You didn't collapse. You didn't provoke. You didn't chase. You didn't dramatize. And now you're not rewriting the story to make it easier for them to live with. That consistency sends a powerful message. I saw what happened, and I adjusted my life accordingly. This is why avoidants often struggle most when the other person heals cleanly. Healing with bitterness gives them an out. Healing while still seeking validation keeps them central. But healing with clarity, without revenge, without romanticizing, removes them from the emotional center of the narrative entirely. And that's where shame grows, because shame is not about being judged by others. It's about losing the ability to justify yourself internally. They can no longer say, it wasn't that bad, or they'll understand eventually. Your forward motion signals that understanding was never the requirement. Respect was, importantly, this is not about you being cold or detached. It's about why, being integrated. You've made peace with what happened without needing it to be different. And that peace communicates something very specific. The cost of their avoidance was real. It was paid. Avoidants often expect emotional access to remain available indefinitely. They assume the door stays unlocked, even if they walk away repeatedly. But when you don't rewrite the past, when you don't offer emotional absolution through reinterpretation, door quietly closes. Not out of anger, but out of completion. And that's what lingers with them. Not what you said, not what you demanded. But the realization that the story ended without their permission and without you carrying their emotional weight any longer. So if you ever wonder whether it mattered that you didn't soften the truth, remember this. When you let the past stand exactly as it was, you don't shame them. You free yourself. And in that freedom, they're left alone with the one thing avoidance can't outrun reality. And now we arrive at the culmination of everything that has been quietly unfolding. All the stability, all the independence, all the calm reclamation of energy. It leads to this moment, the moment where the avoidant is forced to confront a truth they have spent their life avoiding. It's not about guilt anymore. It's not even about panic. It's about capacity, about limits, about realizing, finally, that they cannot receive what you are offering even if they wanted to. And that realization is far more profound and far more destabilizing than anything they've experienced before. Avoidants leave for a reason. Often that reason is not that they don't care. It's that they cannot handle closeness. Intimacy triggers a nervous system that doesn't know how to integrate vulnerability with safety. And the very traits that make you strong, self-aware, and emotionally intelligent, the traits that allow you to regulate yourself and expand your life, are precisely what reveal the gaps in their own emotional system. They didn't leave because they don't value you. They left because they couldn't measure up to what you naturally embody. Think about that for a moment. It's a bitter realization, even if it doesn't surface as bitterness. The avoidant has always relied on withdrawal, on avoidance, on creating a sense of safety through distance. And now, after all these stages, after watching you survive, after seeing you reclaim your energy, after witnessing your life flow and expand without them, they face the quiet, unavoidable truth. They are limited. Their capacity for connection, for presence, for reciprocal emotional investment has a ceiling, and you have surpassed it. What does that mean for them psychologically? It means their identity, which has often been built around control, withdrawal, and selective engagement, is being confronted by something irreversible. They see the life you are leading, the self you are becoming, and it doesn't fit into the world they can PR, ovide. They begin to understand at a visceral level that no amount of charm, manipulation, or avoidance can bring them fully into your orbit. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer shrinking. You are no longer dependent. And they are left with an internal dissonance that they cannot solve philosophically. This is where the concept of irreversibility comes alive. They cannot return you to the version of yourself that once relied on them. They cannot undo your growth. And they cannot pretend that their absence has no impact. The life you are building, the emotional and energetic overflow that defines your days, forces them to confront not just loss, but their own limitation. For the first time, they are seeing the consequences of avoidance in a mirror they cannot look away from. This moment is transformative, not for them, but for you. Because when an avoidant realizes they cannot receive what you offer, it crystallizes your own worth. It confirms that your life, your peace, your emotional resilience is not contingent upon anyone else's capacity. And that confirmation is the ultimate liberation. You are no longer measuring yourself against their limitations. You are no longer constrained by the fear that their absence will diminish you. You are fully present in your own growth, your own power, and your own emotional abundance. And here's the final truth they will silently grapple with. They feel the weight of having lost someone who cannot be contained, managed, are diminished. They feel the loss of potential that they themselves were not capable of fulfilling. Watching your water overflow is not just a reflection of your success. It's a reflection of the emotional environment they could never inhabit. And that reflection is unavoidable. It forces them to recognize, in a way they cannot escape, that the connection they left was never lost because of anything you did. It was lost because of what they could not bring to it. So when we bring all of this together, the expectation of collapse that never came, the guilt triggered by your stability, the panic of seeing your life expand, the quiet power of reclaiming your energy, the respect and shame that emerge when you don't rewrite the past, it all converges in this final reckoning. The avoidant is left to face their own limits while you stand fully realized, flowing, and undiminished. And here is the line I want you to hold on to, the truth that completes this journey. They didn't lose you because you left them. They lost themselves because they could never rise to meet the fullness of who you are. You were never the problem. Your overflow revealed theirs. And now you are free. So what have we uncovered today? You've seen it all unfold. The avoidant leaves expecting collapse, expecting scarcity, expecting you to crumble, but you didn't. You stayed grounded. You reclaimed your energy. You allowed yourself to grow without chasing, without dramatizing, without rewriting the past to make them comfortable. In the process, something extraordinary happened. Their guilt surfaced, their panic emerged, and their nervous system stirred, all because you refused to shrink for someone who couldn't handle your fullness. You demonstrated, without saying a word, that your life, your peace, your happiness were never contingent upon their presence. And that simple truth, that you are whole on your own, is what shakes an avoidant. At their core, they watch as your water overflows, as your life expands beyond the limits they could ever reach, and they are forced to confront what they could never provide: capacity, presence, emotional resilience, and authenticity. You didn't break, you didn't chase, you didn't beg. You simply became fully yourself. And in doing so, you revealed a reality they have spent their lives avoiding. They were never the source of your stability, your growth, or your joy. Remember this, the avoidant doesn't feel your power because of confrontation or drama or pursuit. They feel it because of your consistency, your calm, and your self-respect. They feel it because you proved that your life cannot be controlled, diminished, or contained by someone who cannot handle your truth. And that is the ultimate lesson and the ultimate victory. You were never the problem. You were never the one who needed fixing. You were never the one who had to shrink for someone else's comfort. Your overflow, your growth, and your resilience are undeniable proof that you are enough, whole, and powerful exactly as you are. So stand in that truth. Live in that freedom. Let your life overflow in ways that they could never manage, and let their inability to handle it remind you of your own strength. Because when you do, you don't just survive, you thrive. And that, my friends, is the final message. Your wholeness cannot be stolen, and your life will always flow with or without them.